You've probably stayed in a hotel before, haven't you? Maybe just for a night, maybe longer. Maybe you've checked in late, exhausted, tossing your bag onto the chair, collapsing into the sheets, never thinking twice about the people who've occupied the room before you. Maybe you've left the curtains open, not realizing who might be watching. But tell me, have you ever woken up in a hotel room feeling like something was off? Not wrong exactly, just different. Maybe the air felt thicker. Maybe the silence felt too deep, as if someone had been there only moments before. Or maybe you woke up certain, absolutely certain, that someone had been standing at the foot of your bed, watching. That's how it starts, with something small. The Grand Mercier Hotel was the kind of place people checked into and never really thought about again. A hotel with a long history, gleaming chandeliers, and a front desk that still used brass keys instead of digital cards, because management thought it added character. It was the kind of hotel that businessmen liked, reliable, discreet. You could check in, make your deals, and slip out before anyone noticed you were there. But not this time. Not for him. He checked in at 11:43 p.m. A man in a dark gray suit, the kind that looked expensive but not flashy. Tall, mid-40s, well-groomed. A man with money but not power. Not the kind that makes people remember your name. Just another businessman passing through Chicago, another client in the books. He gave his name as Daniel Whitmore. Daniel requested a room on a high floor. Somewhere quiet, he had said. He barely looked up from his phone as the receptionist smiled and handed him the key to room 405. She wouldn't remember much else about him. Just another guest. Just another night. Security footage would later show him stepping into the elevator alone, pressing the button for the fourth floor, rubbing his temples as if nursing a headache. He didn't look up, didn't fidget. No signs of fear, no hesitation. Just a man heading to bed. At 1:15 a.m., the first strange thing happened. A guest in room 407 called down to the front desk, said she couldn't sleep, said she thought she heard whispering from the other room, said it sounded like someone talking to themselves. The night manager checked the system. Room 405 was booked to Daniel Whitmore. Alone, no other guests. They let it go. Hotels make noise. Walls are thin. People talk in their sleep. At 8:07 a.m., housekeeping knocked on the door. No answer. They knocked again. Still nothing. That wasn't unusual. Guests often slept in, hungover, exhausted, or just unwilling to be disturbed. But by 12:30 p.m., checkout time came and went, and the front desk still hadn't heard from Mr. Whitmore. Calls to his room went unanswered. His credit card was still on file. The room was still locked from the inside. The housekeeper on duty, a young woman named Carla, was the first to open the door. She would later tell police that something felt wrong the moment she stepped inside. The room smelled different. Not like sweat or alcohol or leftover takeout. Not even like death, though she had smelled that before. It smelled sterile. Like the air had been scrubbed clean, erased. Then she saw him. Daniel Whitmore sat at the small wooden desk by the window, perfectly still. His suit jacket was draped over the chair. His hands rested on the armrests, limp. His head was tilted slightly forward, chin to his chest. For a moment, Carla thought he had fallen asleep sitting up. Then she saw the blood. His wrists had been sliced open with slow, deliberate precision, the cuts clean and deep. The blood had dripped down onto the carpet, darkening the fibers beneath the chair. The veins in his arms lay open like empty rivers. His skin was pale, nearly translucent. But that wasn't the worst part. No, the worst part was his chest. Carved into the flesh of his sternum, deep enough to scar, but careful enough not to kill him immediately, were 4 words. I watched you sleep. Carla never screamed. She told the police that later, when they asked her about it. She just stood there staring at the words carved into his skin, feeling the cold press against her spine. She wasn't sure why she looked toward the bed. Maybe instinct, maybe some small crawling part of her brain had already put the pieces together. The sheets were neatly folded, the pillows fluffed. There were no signs that anyone had ever slept in it. Daniel Whitmore had never made it to the bed. He had sat in that chair all night, sat there awake, sat there bleeding, sat there while someone had carved those words into his chest, and he had done nothing to stop them. You might think a place like the Grand Mercier would be used to tragedy, that the people who worked there had seen enough overdoses, enough heart attacks, enough quiet deaths behind locked doors to make them numb. But there's something different about a body that shouldn't be dead. There's something different about a man found sitting upright in a chair, wrists split open, words carved into his skin as if they were meant to be read. It lingers. It infects. It turns a hotel room into something else entirely. The police arrived at 1:42 p.m., almost exactly 12 hours after Daniel Whitmore had checked into room 405. By then, the hotel manager had locked the door again, as if somehow closing it would contain whatever had happened inside. As if shutting out the sight of him would erase the fact that he had died in that room, not screaming, not fighting, but sitting silently, waiting for the blood to stop pumping. Detective Samuel Arden was the first to step inside after the forensic team. He had been with the department for 18 years, long enough to know that people do terrible things to themselves, long enough to know that people can break in ways that don't always make sense. But this didn't feel like a man breaking. It felt like something else. The air in room 405 was cold, colder than it should have been for a summer afternoon in Chicago. The kind of cold that seeps into your ribs, that slows your breathing just enough to make you notice. He didn't like the way the room felt. That was the only way he could describe it later. It wasn't the smell of blood, or the eerie stillness of the furniture, or even the body sitting there like a puppet whose strings had been cut. It was something beneath all of that, something that crawled under the skin. The forensic photographer took pictures of the words carved into the man's chest. "I watched you sleep." The letters were deep, careful, as if the person who had made them wanted to be sure they lasted. Not jagged, not hurried, precise, intimate, like a signature. But what stood out most wasn't the cuts themselves. It was the fact that there was no sign of a struggle, no defensive wounds, no restraints, no bruises, nothing to suggest that Daniel Whitmore had fought back. Arden glanced at the bed, at the perfectly smooth sheets, at the untouched pillow, and a thought curled at the back of his mind like a whisper. He never went to sleep. He sat there all night, awake, bleeding. And someone else was in that room with him. The autopsy would later confirm what Arden already suspected. The cuts had been made over the course of several hours. Daniel Whitmore had been alive for most of it. The forensic team combed through the room, dusting for prints, checking every surface, every crevice, searching for something that would make sense of the scene. The door had been locked from the inside. The windows had been latched shut. There were no signs of forced entry, no signs that anyone had come in or out after Daniel Whitmore. But they found something else, something that made less sense than anything else in that room: the television. The screen was off when they entered, but when the tech team pulled the internal logs, they found that it had been turned on at exactly 1:12 a.m., 3 minutes before the guest in room 407 called the front desk about the whispering. There was no channel listed, no recorded program, just 3 minutes of static before it shut off again. Arden played it back, listened to the faint white noise crackling through the speakers. He turned the volume up, just in case, just to be sure. There was something underneath the static, a sound too soft to make out at first. He let it play again, closing his eyes, focusing. A breath. A slow, measured inhale. Then right before the screen went dark, a whisper. Not words, just the shape of them. Just the presence of someone else in that room. The forensic team bagged the television for further analysis. Arden stepped out into the hall, rolling the tension from his shoulders, trying to shake the feeling that the room was watching him. Outside, the hotel staff stood in uneasy clusters, whispering among themselves, casting nervous glances at room 405. Carla, the housekeeper who had found the body, sat on a bench near the elevator, her hands wrapped around a styrofoam cup of coffee that she hadn't taken a sip from. She looked up when Arden approached, her eyes still hollow, still caught somewhere between shock and something deeper. I knocked 3 times, she said, before he could even ask her a question. I always knock 3 times. I waited. I listened. And I swear to God, detective, I swear to God, I felt someone in that room. Arden crouched in front of her, careful, slow, letting her speak in her own time. What do you mean? Carla swallowed. I mean, I could feel them. Right there, just behind the door. She looked down at her coffee, her fingers tightening around the cup. I thought he was standing there, not answering. I almost walked away. But then I used the key, and he was like that. Arden didn't say anything at first. He let the words settle, let them find their weight. Then finally he asked, Did you hear anything before you opened the door? She hesitated. Yes. Her voice was barely above a whisper. It sounded like breathing. The kind of silence that followed wasn't the ordinary kind. Not the kind that happens when people don't know what to say. It was the kind that fills a space when something isn't finished. Arden stood, nodding slowly. Somewhere in the hotel, a radio crackled from an open doorway. Someone was watching the news. The anchor's voice drifted down the hall, tinny and distant. The victim, identified as Daniel Whitmore, was a financial consultant based in New York. Authorities have not yet determined whether his death was self-inflicted or the result of foul play, though the circumstances remain highly unusual. Investigators are asking anyone who may have seen or heard anything unusual at the Grand Mercier Hotel between the hours of... Arden tuned it out, his mind already sifting through possibilities, already pressing against the pieces that didn't fit. A locked room, a man who didn't fight back, a television turning on at exactly 1:12 a.m., and a sentence carved into the skin of a man who should have screamed. I watched you sleep. Arden turned back to the door of room 405. The crime scene tape fluttered slightly as the ventilation kicked in. The room waited. He had the distinct, unshakable feeling that whatever had happened inside, it wasn't over. The Grand Mercier had 29 security cameras, all placed at strategic points. One in the lobby near the check-in desk, 2 covering the entrance, a handful monitoring the elevators, and several more lining the halls of each floor. Room 405 sat near the far end of the 4th-floor corridor, right in the middle of 2 cameras, both angled just enough to catch the doors of every room in the hallway. Every time a guest entered or left their room, it was recorded. Every movement was captured. Detective Arden sat in the small, windowless security office of the hotel, his fingers tapping restlessly against the arm of his chair as he watched the footage from the night before. The grainy black and white images flickered across the screen, playing in real time from 11:43 p.m. The moment Daniel Whitmore stepped out of the elevator, heading toward room 405. Arden leaned forward slightly, his eyes narrowing as he tracked the man's movements. There was nothing unusual about the way he walked, nothing hesitant or uncertain, no glances over his shoulder, no moments of pause. He simply strode forward, pulled the key from his pocket, unlocked the door, and vanished inside. Arden fast-forwarded. For nearly 2 hours, nothing moved. The hallway remained eerily still, only the occasional flicker of the light breaking the monotony. At 1:12 a.m., the exact time the television in room 405 turned on, Arden watched the timestamp tick forward, and then he saw it. At 1:14 a.m., a shadow passed near the edge of the frame. It was subtle, barely there, a sliver of movement just at the boundary of the camera's reach. Arden rewound the footage, slowing it down, playing it frame by frame. The shape was indistinct, but it was there, hovering just outside of room 405. No details, no features, just the impression of something standing in the hall. He played it again. The shadow did not come from the elevator. It did not emerge from another room. It simply appeared, motionless, at the farthest stretch of the camera's vision. It remained there for exactly 4 minutes. Then at 1:18 a.m., it was gone. Arden leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly, his mind already shifting through possibilities. A guest, a staff member, someone who had managed to slip through security? He rewound the footage further, checking the previous minutes, scanning for any sign of someone walking down the hallway. Nothing. No one. The shadow had simply arrived, He turned to the hotel security officer, a heavy-set man named Brant, who had been with the Grand Mercier for nearly 10 years. The kind of guy who had seen it all: drunken brawls, prostitutes sneaking in through the back entrance, even a dead body or two, though none quite like this one. Brant frowned at the screen, arms crossed over his chest, his usual detached professionalism replaced by something close to unease. "Could be a glitch," he said, though his tone suggested he didn't quite believe it himself. "Sometimes the cameras pick up weird shadows, lighting issues, stuff like that." Arden glanced at him. "You ever seen a glitch that stands still for 4 minutes and then disappears?" Brant didn't answer. Arden turned back to the footage, staring at the empty hallway. He didn't like what this meant. The fact that something had been standing outside that door in the middle of the night, just minutes before the whispering started. The fact that there were no signs of forced entry. The fact that Daniel Whitmore had been locked in that room, alone. And yet, something had been there. Arden rubbed his temple, his gut twisting with something he couldn't quite name. He switched to the interior hallway camera from a different angle, checking to see if the shadow had appeared anywhere else in the building. And then he found her. At 12:59 a.m., a woman stepped out of the stairwell on the 3rd floor. She was dressed in a housekeeper's uniform, dark pants, a gray polo with the hotel's logo stitched above the chest. Her dark hair was pulled back into a tight bun, and her face was turned away from the camera as she moved down the hall with slow, careful steps. Arden paused the video. Something about the way she walked didn't sit right with him. It wasn't the usual hurried pace of a staff member finishing a late shift. It wasn't even the tired shuffle of someone heading toward the break room. There was purpose in the way she moved, as if she was following a path only she could see. He played the video again. She walked toward one of the housekeeping closets, retrieved a cleaning cart, and wheeled it toward the elevator. But she never pressed the button, never called the elevator at all. Instead, she just stood there, perfectly still, her back to the camera. At 1:05 a.m., she turned. Arden leaned in, his fingers tightening around the mouse as he watched her face come into view for the first time. She was smiling. Not the polite, professional smile of a housekeeper on duty. Not the absent expression of someone lost in thought. It was something else entirely. Wide, fixed. The kind of smile that doesn't belong in an empty hallway in the middle of the night. Then, without warning, she walked away, pushing the cart back toward the stairwell, vanishing through the door. Arden fast-forwarded, checking the rest of the footage. She never came back. "Who is she?" Arden asked, his voice steady despite the way his pulse had quickened. Brant frowned, scratching his jaw. "That's Olivia." Olivia Kessler. Arden recognized the name. She had worked at the Grand Mercier for years, long enough that most of the other staff knew her by name. He remembered seeing her in the employee files, her record clean, her performance reviews glowing. Brant nodded. "Yeah, but that's weird." "What?" Brant hesitated, then reached for the keyboard, typing in a few quick commands before pulling up another file. A different camera feed, a different time. "This is from yesterday afternoon," Brant said, tapping the screen. Arden watched as Olivia Kessler walked out of the building at exactly 4:23 p.m., her bag slung over her shoulder, her uniform neatly pressed. She stepped onto the sidewalk, heading toward the bus stop. Then the timestamp flickered. 4:24 p.m. She never came back. Brant glanced at Arden, uneasy. "She wasn't on the night shift, Detective. She clocked out at 4:30 and never returned." Arden stared at the footage, at the woman who had walked through the hotel in the middle of the night, at the eerie smile that had stretched across her face. If Olivia Kessler had never come back to work, then who had been standing in the hallway outside room 405 at 1:14 a.m.? And more importantly, where was she now? Detective Arden sat in his car outside Olivia Kessler's apartment, drumming his fingers against the steering wheel, watching the windows of her unit on the 3rd floor. The building was one of those old weathered complexes, the kind where the paint peeled from the balconies and the mailboxes in the lobby hung slightly crooked on their hinges. It was the kind of place that looked quiet from the outside, but carried a weight beneath the surface. The kind of weight you could feel if you stood still long enough. According to the building's records, Olivia Kessler had lived here for nearly 6 years, long enough for neighbors to recognize her, long enough for the landlord to remember her by name. But as Arden had quickly realized, none of them had seen her in 3 days. He exhaled slowly, checking his watch. 2:17 p.m. The hotel's security footage showed her leaving the Grand Mercier at exactly 4:23 p.m., 2 days before Daniel Whitmore had checked in. Since then, there had been no credit card activity, no phone calls made from her number, no sign that she had ever made it home. And yet, she had somehow appeared in the hotel hallways at 1:05 a.m. the night of the murder. Dressed in her uniform, moving with a kind of quiet, deliberate precision that unsettled him more the longer he thought about it. Arden grabbed the file from the passenger seat, flipping it open, scanning the notes he had scribbled earlier. Olivia Kessler, age 34, employed at the Grand Mercier Hotel for a little over a decade. No history of violence, no criminal record, a quiet, unassuming employee. But there was something else, something buried in the fine print. 2 years ago, she had been suspended for a week. The incident report was vague. A guest had complained, said they had woken up in the middle of the night to find Olivia standing inside their room. She had claimed it was a misunderstanding, said she had gone in to clean and had assumed the guest was out. But the report stated otherwise. The guest, a man in his late 50s, had described something different. He said she had been watching him. He had woken up to find her standing near the foot of his bed, her hands clasped neatly in front of her expression calm. He had asked what she was doing. She hadn't answered. She had just stood there silent before finally turning and walking out of the room. The hotel had let her come back after a week. No other incidents were reported. But Arden couldn't shake the feeling that it hadn't stopped. That maybe whatever she had been doing, she had simply gotten better at hiding it. He closed the file, stepping out of the car, heading toward the building's entrance. Inside, the air smelled faintly of mildew, the kind of dampness that clung to old carpets, the kind that never really left. Arden climbed the stairs 2 at a time. Stopping in front of apartment 3B, he knocked. No answer. He knocked again, louder this time. Silence. Something about that silence felt wrong. Arden pressed his ear against the door, listening. The apartment complex was quiet. No sounds of a television, no murmured voices from the other side. Then he heard it, a soft, rhythmic creaking. It was slow, steady, the kind of sound a chair makes when someone is rocking back and forth, the kind of sound that doesn't belong in an otherwise silent apartment. Arden took a step back, glancing down the hall, considering his options. Technically, he didn't have probable cause to enter, but something was off. He knocked again, harder this time. "Miss Kessler?" The creaking stopped. A long, empty pause stretched between him and the door. Then, the lock turned. The knob twisted slightly, but the door didn't open. It remained closed, the air thick with something unseen, something that made the hairs on Arden's arms rise. A shadow shifted behind the peephole. Arden's pulse picked up. "Miss Kessler, this is Detective Arden. I need to speak with you." His voice was steady, calm, but his hand was already hovering near his holster. No response. Then slowly the door creaked open an inch. The hallway light spilled into the darkness beyond, cutting through the stale air. Arden took a step forward, glancing inside. The apartment was bare. No furniture, no pictures on the walls. No clutter, no signs of life. Just an empty room with peeling wallpaper and a single wooden chair sitting in the center of the floor. And in that chair, Olivia Kessler. She sat with her hands folded neatly in her lap, her dark hair pulled into the same tight bun he had seen on the security footage. Her expression was vacant, her lips barely parted, as if she had been about to say something, but had forgotten the words. She was rocking, slowly, methodically, back and forth, back and forth. Arden stepped inside, his footfalls echoing against the bare wooden floor. "Ms. Kessler," he said again, quieter this time. She didn't react. Her eyes were open, but they were wrong, not unfocused, not distant. Empty. Arden swallowed. The air in the apartment was stale, unmoving, thick with something that pressed against his skin. "Olivia," he tried again. Where have you been? A long pause. Then finally she spoke. I don't sleep, she murmured. Her voice was soft, distant, as if the words weren't really meant for him. Her fingers curled slightly in her lap. Arden took another step forward, his instincts screaming that something was very wrong. Olivia, I need you to come with me. We need to talk about what happened at the hotel. She tilted her head slightly, her lips twitching. I watch, she whispered. Arden's stomach tightened. What do you watch? Her eyes focused then, just for a second. You, she said. The room felt smaller. The air felt thicker. A cold, creeping sensation worked its way up Arden's spine. Something primal, something his body recognized before his mind could catch up. And then, her lips curved. Not a smile, not exactly. Something else. And in the dim, hollow silence of that empty apartment, Arden finally realized something that made his breath stop in his throat. The chair was still rocking, but Olivia wasn't moving anymore. Detective Arden stood frozen in the doorway of Olivia Kessler's apartment, the stale air pressing in around him, thick with something he couldn't quite name. The wooden chair rocked slowly, its legs creaking against the bare floorboards, but Olivia wasn't moving. Her body sat rigid, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her expression blank, as if she were a doll someone had left behind. The only thing that moved was the chair, back and forth, as if something unseen had set it in motion and then stepped away. A slow breath filled Arden's lungs, measured, careful, the kind of breath a man takes when he knows something is very, very wrong. He had seen death before, had walked into rooms that felt heavy with it, but this was different. The air wasn't thick with decay. It was thick with something else, something that watched. Olivia, he said again, his voice lower now, cautious, probing. She didn't answer. She didn't blink. Her eyes, wide and dark, were fixed on something behind him, something that wasn't there. The room was empty. There was nothing but the walls, the chair, the faint trace of dust lingering in the air. But the chair kept rocking. Arden took a step forward, his pulse hammering against his ribs, the weight of his own hesitation pulling at him. Every part of his instincts told him to turn around and leave, to shut the door and let someone else deal with whatever this was. But he was past that now. He had started down this path, had walked too far into the dark to pretend he didn't see it anymore. Olivia, he tried again, softer this time. I need you to tell me what happened in room 405. Her lips parted just slightly, her breath barely a whisper. I watched him, she murmured. Arden's fingers twitched at his side. Why? A pause. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. Then finally she spoke again. He let me. A slow, crawling sensation worked its way up Arden's spine, something cold and oily, something that settled in the space between his ribs and refused to leave. He wanted to ask her what she meant, wanted to press her for answers, but something about the way she sat there, unmoving, unreadable, made the words feel useless in his mouth. Instead, he reached for his radio. This is Detective Arden. I need immediate backup at 1724 Ashland Avenue. Possible suspect in custody. The static crackled, a brief response confirming his request, and then silence again. The chair finally stopped rocking. Olivia blinked once, slow and deliberate. Then, for the first time since he had stepped into the apartment, she turned her head and looked directly at him. You only caught me because I wanted you to, she said. Arden's jaw tightened. What does that mean? Olivia tilted her head, her expression shifting, something almost like amusement flickering behind her otherwise empty eyes. You think you're asking the right questions, she said, but you aren't. He exhaled sharply, pushing down the frustration coiling in his chest. Then help me. What am I missing? Her gaze drifted past him again, her shoulders perfectly still, as if she were waiting for something. Or someone. You already know, she whispered. A sound drifted through the apartment. A breath, software shallow, right behind him. Arden moved before he had time to think, his hand flying to his holster as he spun around, his breath catching in his throat. But there was nothing. The room was empty. No one stood behind him. No shadows stretched along the walls. No movement, no sign that anything had changed. Just the cold, still air, the peeling wallpaper, the dust hanging in the dim afternoon light. And yet, he had heard it, the breath, close enough to feel. His grip tightened around the gun, his body rigid, his pulse hammering in his ears. He turned back to Olivia, but she was no longer looking at him. She was staring at the empty space behind him, smiling. Arden swallowed hard, forcing himself to breathe, to focus, to think. This was a game. It had to be. A mind trick. Something calculated. Something meant to unsettle. But he had been a cop for too long to fall for that kind of manipulation. He had seen killers play their little games, had watched them toy with people who didn't understand what they were dealing with. He wasn't going to be one of them. "You're coming with me," he said, his voice steady despite the way his skin prickled. Olivia didn't argue. She just stood, smooth and slow, her movements precise. She let him cuff her wrists without resistance, her pulse steady beneath his fingers. She let him lead her out of the apartment, down the narrow stairwell, out into the humid Chicago air where his squad car waited. She didn't speak, not as he guided her into the back seat, not as he shut the door behind her, not as he turned back to glance up at her empty apartment one last time. But just as he slid into the driver's seat, just as he turned the key in the ignition, Olivia finally leaned forward, her breath barely fogging the partition between them. "You won't sleep tonight," she murmured. Arden's fingers froze on the wheel. For the first time since he had walked into room 405, he felt something crawl beneath his skin, something small but insidious, something that had been waiting all along. He swallowed, exhaled, and pulled away from the curb, leaving the apartment building behind. He didn't look in the rearview mirror, not once. That night, long after he had finished his report, long after Olivia Kessler had been processed and locked in a holding cell, long after he had finally collapsed onto the mattress in his own apartment, Detective Samuel Arden woke up with a start. The room was dark. Too dark. The kind of dark that felt thick. The kind that made the air heavy in his lungs. He sat up, exhaling slowly, running a hand over his face, trying to shake the lingering weight of the case, the strange unease that clung to him like a second skin. And then he felt it. A shift in the air, a presence, a slow, steady breath just beyond the foot of his bed. Arden didn't move, didn't breathe, didn't blink. Because in that moment, in the silence of his own bedroom, he knew he was being watched. I almost didn't stop. It was late, the kind of late that makes the world feel emptier than it is. The kind of late where gas stations feel like islands floating in the dark, separate from the rest of the world. I had been driving for hours, my eyes dry, my hands stiff from gripping the wheel, my mind already focused on my apartment, on peeling off my shoes, on letting exhaustion take me under. The highway had been mostly deserted, just the occasional set of headlights blinking past, just the rhythmic hum of tires on asphalt to keep me company. When I pulled into the gas station, I didn't think about anything except filling up and getting back on the road. The place was nearly empty. A single overhead light flickered, buzzing like it was full of dying flies. The convenience store was open, but the guy inside barely glanced up from his phone when I walked past. I moved on autopilot, swiping my card, inserting the nozzle, listening to the gas flow, waiting. Then I heard it, a noise soft but distinct, coming from somewhere close, a faint thump against metal. I stopped, looked around. The station was silent, still. The only other car was an older model sedan, dark-colored, parked over by the air pump. Nobody was inside. No movement, no signs of life. Just a car sitting there, alone, forgotten. I told myself I had imagined it, probably just the wind or the sound of the pump kicking on. I had been driving too long, my mind playing tricks. Then it happened again. Thump. I turned fully this time, my body tensing, something cold sliding down my spine. It had come from the sedan. I stared at it, suddenly aware of the way my own breathing sounded too loud in my ears. The car wasn't running. The trunk was closed but not latched all the way. The slightest gap between the lid and the frame. I should have left. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to get in my car and drive away, to pretend I had heard nothing at all. People do that, you know. People tell themselves something isn't their problem. They make excuses. They decide it's better to let someone else deal with it. I could have done that. I almost did that. Then the trunk exploded open. A figure burst out, stumbling, falling, collapsing onto the pavement with a choked gasp. For a second, I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't understand what I was looking at. Bare feet, skin pale in the fluorescent light, dark hair tangled and damp with sweat, a woman shaking so violently that she could barely stay upright. Her breath came in sharp, ragged gulps, her chest rising and falling too fast, her body struggling to remember how to function after being trapped in that suffocating space. Then she lifted her hands and I saw her fingertips. Or rather, what was missing. The nails were gone, ripped out, the skin beneath raw and angry, the edges stained with dried blood. She was trembling. Not just the kind of shaking that comes from cold or exhaustion, but something deeper, something that came from a terror so profound that it had burrowed into her bones. I took a step forward, my hands raised slightly, my voice careful. Hey, it's okay, I'm not... She looked at me then, and I will never forget the way her eyes looked. Wide, too wide, pupils blown out, darting frantically around the gas station like she was still trapped in that trunk, like she was still expecting someone to pull her back in. She opened her mouth, but at first no sound came out. Just a shuddering breath, a whimper, a broken attempt at speech. Then finally she whispered, "He takes what makes you whole." I didn't understand. What? Her fingers curled into weak fists, her arms wrapping around her own body, as if she were trying to hold herself together. "He takes what makes you whole," she repeated, voice raw, barely audible, like it had been ripped out of her throat. I felt something twist inside me, something dark and sick and wrong. The gas station lights flickered. The world felt off, like the air itself had shifted, like something unseen had just brushed past me. I grabbed my phone, dialed 911, my voice steadier than I expected as I gave them the location, told them what had happened, told them to send someone now. The girl didn't move. She just stood there trembling, swaying slightly on her feet, whispering those words under her breath. And for the first time in my life, standing in that pool of artificial light, surrounded by nothing but silence and the scent of gasoline, I felt like something was watching us. It wasn't until later, when the cops arrived, when they took her away, when they started putting the pieces together, that I learned his name. Russell Kane, a surgeon once, a mechanic now, a man who took things from people, a man who had taken from her. And when they found the place where he had kept her, when they found the others, when they saw what he had left behind in that godforsaken auto shop on the edge of the city, they realized something. She had escaped, but she hadn't been his final masterpiece. Because there was one thing still missing, and he was still out there, waiting to take it. Detective James Holloway had seen plenty of crime scenes in his 15 years with the Atlanta PD, but the moment he stepped inside the abandoned auto shop on the outskirts of the city, he knew this one was different. The air was thick with the scent of oil and something else, something metallic and sour, something that clung to the back of his throat and refused to leave. His boots made soft, sticky sounds as they moved across the concrete floor, and he didn't have to look down to know what he was stepping in. The girl from the gas station had led them here, or rather the car had. The sedan she had escaped from had been registered to an old business, Kane's Auto Repairs, a shop that had shut down nearly a decade ago after a lawsuit over a botched repair job. The owner, Russell Kane, had vanished soon after, disappearing into the folds of the city, reappearing just enough to stay off the radar, but never enough to be caught. He had gone from being a man with a failing business to a ghost, until now. Holloway exhaled through his nose, forcing himself to stay focused, to take in everything the scene had to offer. The walls were lined with old tool racks, rusted and forgotten. dust clinging to the metal like decay. But it wasn't the tools that caught his attention. It was the jars, rows of them, neatly arranged on a long wooden workbench, their glass surfaces clouded with age, their lids sealed tight, and inside, fingers, ears, teeth. Holloway swallowed hard, his stomach twisting despite himself. Each piece had been preserved meticulously, floating in murky liquid, suspended in time. They weren't just trophies, they were collected, carefully chosen, pieces of people who had been taken apart. A crime scene tech moved beside him, her gloved hands shaking slightly as she snapped pictures, the flash illuminating the jars, making them gleam like something out of a nightmare. Holloway turned away, his gaze sweeping the rest of the shop. And then he saw the mirror. It stood in the center of the room, tall and old, its once gilded frame tarnished with age, its surface slightly warped. Unlike everything else in the shop, it was clean. No dust, no grime, as if it had been placed there recently. Holloway stepped closer, his own reflection shifting as he moved. He didn't like the way the room looked in the glass, the way the jars seemed almost alive when viewed through the warped surface. He took another step, his breath steady, his mind already working through the possibilities. And that's when he saw it, a single empty jar, not on the workbench, not among the others, but sitting at the base of the mirror, waiting. Holloway crouched, his pulse slow but heavy in his chest. The jar was clean, its glass free of the murky residue that coated the others. It had never been used, or maybe not yet. A sound came from behind him, the soft creak of the door as another officer stepped inside, his voice low, cautious. "Sir, we pulled some of the old records from Kane's business. You're going to want to see this." Holloway stood, giving the mirror one last glance before following the officer back outside. The air was fresher out here, but only just. The weight of the crime scene still clung to his skin, pressing against his ribs. The officer handed him a file. The paper slightly yellowed, the ink faded but legible. Holloway flipped through it, his eyes scanning quickly, his brain processing faster than his stomach could keep up. And then he stopped. A list. Names, addresses, short notes scribbled in the margins, physical descriptions, traits, perfect nose, symmetrical eyes, flawless skin, a selection, a checklist. Russell Kane hadn't been taking at random. He had been choosing. And there at the very bottom, one last note, one last entry, written in careful, precise handwriting. Final piece, a face worth keeping. Holloway's fingers tightened around the edge of the paper. The girl had escaped, but Kane wasn't finished. Not yet. Detective James Holloway sat in his car outside the hospital, the engine running, the soft hum barely noticeable over the thoughts grinding in his head. The girl, no, Melissa, was inside, hooked up to an IV. Sedated after a full day of questioning, her body finally giving in to exhaustion. She hadn't told them much, not because she was hiding anything, but because she simply couldn't. Her memories were shattered, broken into jagged pieces that didn't fit together. Every time they pushed her for details about Kane, what he had done, how long she had been trapped, her breathing would go shallow, her fingers twitching against the hospital blanket, her eyes glassy with panic. The only thing she had managed to repeat, over and over, was that phrase, "He takes what makes you whole." Holloway hadn't been able to shake it. He had spent the last 12 hours combing through Kane's past, trying to make sense of what they had found in that auto shop. The jars, the mirror, the empty jar. But the most unsettling thing, the thing that had latched on to him and refused to let go, was that list. Kane had a plan. He had been building something, collecting something, piece by piece, and he still wasn't finished. Holloway sighed, rubbing his temples, trying to force his brain to slow down. It wasn't working. There were too many gaps, too many things that didn't add up. Melissa had escaped, yes. She had somehow pried open the trunk of that car, had somehow run into the right gas station at the right time. But Kane wasn't the kind of man to leave loose ends. He should have killed her. So why hadn't he? A tap at his window nearly made him jump. He turned sharply, his hand instinctively moving toward his gun, but it was just Officer Danvers, his expression tense, his breath fogging slightly against the glass in the cold night air. Holloway rolled down the window. "We got something," Danvers said, voice clipped, urgent. "Security footage. You're going to want to see this." Holloway was out of the car in seconds, following Danvers back into the hospital, his mind already bracing for what was coming. They made their way to a small security room where a tech was sitting in front of a bank of monitors, pausing and rewinding footage. Holloway barely had time to ask what he was looking at before the screen flickered and the video began to play. Hospital hallway, late last night. The timestamp read 2:37 a.m. The hall was empty at first, just the sterile glow of the overhead lights, the faint movement of shadows stretching against the walls. The camera was angled toward Melissa's room, the door slightly ajar. Then from the far end of the hallway, someone stepped into frame. A man, tall, thin, his movements slow, deliberate. He was wearing dark clothes, nothing that would stand out in a crowd, but the way he walked, too smooth, too careful, made Holloway's skin crawl. He moved closer to the camera, his face coming into view for just a moment, just long enough to see the sharp angles of his jaw, the hollowness of his cheeks, the deep-set eyes that didn't blink. Holloway's stomach turned to ice. Russell Kane. He watched as Kane reached Melissa's door. He didn't rush. He didn't hesitate. He just stood there for a moment, one hand resting lightly against the wood, his head tilting slightly, as if he were listening. Then, without a sound, he pushed the door open. Holloway clenched his jaw, his fingers curling into fists as the video continued. Kane stepped inside. The door shut behind him. For nearly 4 minutes, the hallway was empty. Then the door opened again. But Kane didn't come back out. Holloway felt his pulse pounding in his ears. "That's it?" The tech swallowed. "That's it. No sign of him leaving. No exits. No other footage of him anywhere in the building. It's like he just disappeared." Holloway didn't believe in ghosts. He believed in evidence, in patterns, in people making mistakes. But this was something else. Kane had walked in, but he hadn't walked out, which meant one thing. He was still somewhere inside. Detective James Holloway stood outside Melissa Carter's hospital room, his breath slow and controlled, his pulse anything but. The video had been clear. Russell Kane had walked into this room at 2:37 a.m. 4 minutes had passed. Then the door had opened again, but Kane had never come back out. No other exits, no other footage of him anywhere in the building. He had just vanished. But Holloway had been in this room 3 times since this morning, and Kane was not there. At least not in any way that made sense. He exhaled slowly, gripping the handle, and pushed the door open. The room was small, too small for the weight it carried. Melissa lay in the bed, her body still, her face turned slightly toward the window. She was asleep, the sedatives still keeping her under, her breathing shallow but steady. The machines next to her beeped in soft intervals, the only sound in the room besides the faint hum of fluorescent lights overhead. And yet, Holloway could feel it. The air was too still. The shadows stretched just a little too long. There was something wrong with this space, something his body recognized before his brain could catch up. He scanned the room carefully, his instincts sharpened from years of knowing when something was off. He checked the corners, the closet, the space beneath the bed. Nothing. He walked to the window, pressing his palm against the glass, feeling the cold bite at his skin. The hospital was 5 stories up, no fire escape, no balcony. The only way out was the door he had just walked through. So where the hell was Russell Kane? Holloway turned back to Melissa, watching the slow rise and fall of her chest. He knew he should let her rest. He knew that waking her now would only push her deeper into exhaustion, would send her body further into shock. But he also knew one thing with absolute certainty. Russell Kane had been here, which meant there was a chance that he still was. Holloway moved closer to the bed, keeping his voice low, measured. "Melissa," he said, just loud enough to press through the fog of sedatives. "I need you to wake up." She didn't move at first. Then a small twitch of her fingers, a shift of breath. Her eyelids fluttered slightly before peeling open, unfocused and dazed. Holloway crouched beside the bed, keeping his expression calm despite the tightness in his chest. Melissa, I need to ask you something. I know you're tired. I know this is hard, but I need you to try to remember. Last night, did anyone come into this room? Her breathing changed. Not a gasp, not a flinch. Just a subtle shift, a slight quickening of breath, as if something deep inside her had been waiting for this question. Her gaze drifted toward the ceiling, then to the far corner of the room, then finally to the mirror on the opposite wall. Holloway's throat went dry. The mirror was standard hospital issue, wide and clean, positioned so that the patient could see themselves from the bed. But now standing here, looking at it through Melissa's eyes, Holloway realized something. It wasn't just reflecting her, it was reflecting the empty space beside her bed, the space where someone should have been. Melissa's lips parted, the barest whisper escaping. He never left. Holloway didn't hesitate. He turned sharply, yanking his gun from its holster, his instincts roaring to the surface. His finger rested on the trigger, his breath slow, steady, his pulse a hammer in his ears. But the room was empty. No movement, no shadows shifting in the dim light. And yet Melissa was still looking at the mirror, still staring at something. Holloway forced himself to turn back toward the glass, to let his eyes adjust, to let himself see. At first there was nothing, just his own reflection, tense, waiting. The empty chair beside the bed, the soft white sheets, the curve of the bedside lamp casting a long shadow. And then, a shape, just for a second, a figure standing behind him. But before his brain could even register what he was seeing, the lights flickered. And the shape was gone. Melissa made a soft, broken sound in her throat, her fingers gripping the blanket so tightly that her knuckles turned white. "He's still here," she whispered. "He's still watching." Holloway clenched his jaw, stepping back from the mirror, his pulse thudding in his ears. He didn't believe in ghosts. He believed in monsters, in the things that men did to each other, in the way that horror didn't need to be supernatural to be real. But Russell Kane had walked into this room, and somehow, in a way Holloway couldn't yet understand, he had never walked out. Detective James Holloway had always believed in logic, in patterns, in the kind of evil that could be understood, dissected, and eventually stopped. But standing in that hospital room, staring into the mirror that had shown him something impossible, listening to the slow, uneven breaths of the girl who had barely escaped, he felt something he hadn't in a long time. A feeling he hated, a feeling he had spent years ignoring. The cold prickle of fear. Melissa was still staring at the glass, her breath shallow, her fingers curled so tightly into the blanket that her fingernails dug into the fabric. Holloway could see the sweat beating along her forehead, could hear the faint tremor in her breathing, the way she was trying so hard not to move, because she knew something was still here. Holloway took a slow step back, forcing his own breath to steady, his fingers tight around his gun. The mirror stood in front of him, perfectly still, perfectly ordinary. And yet, in the moment before the lights had flickered, he had seen it. A figure, standing right behind him. He didn't believe in ghosts, but he did believe in monsters. And Russell Kane was a monster, one who had somehow managed to do something no killer ever had before. He had disappeared, but not in the way people vanish when they run. Not in the way criminals hide. Kane had simply stopped being there. Holloway's throat felt dry as he spoke, his voice quieter than he intended. "Melissa, you need to tell me exactly what happened last night. When he came into this room." She swallowed, her throat bobbing, her lips pressing together as if she was trying to keep something in. Something that was too big, too heavy, too dangerous to let out. "He came to take it," she whispered. Holloway frowned, glancing back at the empty chair beside the bed. "Take what?" Melissa's gaze flickered toward the mirror again, and this time when she spoke, it was almost too quiet to hear. "The last piece." Holloway felt his pulse slow, the weight of her words sinking in like stones dropping into deep water. Russell Kane had been collecting, choosing, taking the pieces he wanted, the ones he considered perfect. Fingers, ears, eyes, each preserved, each stored in glass jars like they were pieces of an unfinished puzzle. But his final piece, his last piece, a face, a face worth keeping. Holloway felt a cold, creeping realization spread through his chest, something he didn't want to name, something that made his skin feel too tight. He turned slowly, his eyes drifting back to the mirror, his own reflection staring back at him. And in that moment, something shifted. The room felt smaller. The air felt thicker. The reflection in the mirror didn't feel like his anymore. His face, his own face, looked the same. And yet something was wrong. The angles were slightly off, the eyes too hollow, the expression too still. And then, before he could react, before he could blink, before he could do anything, his reflection smiled. Not him. Not the face standing in the hospital room. The one in the glass. Holloway's breath caught in his throat, his body locked in place, every nerve in his body screaming at him to move, move, move. The lights flickered again, and in that half second of darkness, he felt it. Something cold against his skin, something pressing against his face. A hand, but not a hand. Fingers, but not fingers. Then the lights came back. The mirror was empty, and Holloway knew. Kane had been here, but he hadn't come for Melissa. Not this time. The last piece. The final piece. Holloway didn't realize he had stopped breathing until Melissa whispered. He took it, didn't he? He turned slowly, his body tense, the hair on the back of his neck still standing on end. He didn't answer. He didn't know how to. Because something was wrong. Something was missing. And then, for the first time in his entire career, he was afraid to look in the mirror. Because he wasn't sure what would be looking back. You don't expect a phone to ring at 3 in the morning. Not in a church. Not when the only sounds are the creaking of the old wooden beams, the wind pressing against the stained glass, and the steady tick of the clock on the far wall. But that's exactly what happened. I had been sitting in the small study adjacent to the chapel, a half-burned candle flickering beside me. My Bible open but unread, my mind restless. Sleep had been a stranger to me for weeks, slipping just out of reach, leaving me alone with thoughts that had grown heavier with time. And then, the phone rang. The sound cut through the silence, sharp and shrill, making my pulse jump. My first thought was that someone had died. Calls at this hour were never for anything else. I pushed back my chair, walked to the small desk in the corner, and lifted the receiver. "St. Mark's," I said, my voice rough from disuse. For a moment, there was only breathing. Not frantic, not labored, just there. Then finally a voice, low, measured, unsettlingly calm. "Forgive me, Father, for I have sinned." A confession. I straightened, my grip tightening around the receiver. Confessions at odd hours weren't unheard of. Guilt, after all, doesn't follow a schedule. But something about the way he spoke made the hairs on my arms rise. "What would you like to confess?" I asked carefully. A pause. Then in that same steady voice he said, "I killed a man last night." The air in the study seemed to grow colder. I glanced toward the chapel doors, half expecting them to creak open, half dreading that they actually might. "You took a life?" "Yes, Father, and it wasn't my first." I sank into the chair by the desk, my pulse heavy in my throat. I had heard confessions of terrible things before. Infidelity, theft, violence. But never this. Never someone calmly admitting to murder. Who did you kill?" I asked, my voice quieter now. The man sighed. A long, slow exhale, as if he had been carrying a great weight and was finally setting it down. "His name was Daniel Lowe, 42 years old. Lives alone." Well, lived alone. My stomach turned. He spoke with such certainty, such finality, as if he were reciting facts from a book, something impersonal. I should have ended the call, should have told him I couldn't listen to this, should have demanded he turn himself in. But my fingers stayed locked around the receiver, my breath coming slower, my mind fighting to process what was happening. "How do you know his name?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "I learn them before I take them." The words sent a cold shiver down my spine. I leaned forward, gripping the desk as if it could anchor me. "Why are you telling me this?" The man chuckled softly, almost amused. "Because that's what you do, isn't it? You listen. You take confessions. You offer absolution." I swallowed hard. Murder isn't something I can absolve. Silence. Then so quiet I almost didn't hear it. And yet, I feel lighter already. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to think, trying to understand. This wasn't just a confession. This was something else. A game, a taunt, a cry for help. I forced myself to speak. "Why did you do it?" Another pause. When he spoke again, there was something almost reverent in his voice. "To cleanse them, Father. To strip them of their sins before they die." I gripped the receiver tighter. "And who gave you that right?" He chuckled again, and this time I heard something behind it. A kind of certainty. A belief so deeply ingrained that no argument could shake it. "I did." A sick feeling coiled in my gut. I needed to keep him talking. Needed to draw out details. Needed to... "I think that's enough for tonight," he said suddenly. "But before I go, I have a gift for you." My blood ran cold. "A gift?" A faint rustling sound came through the receiver, like fabric shifting against wood. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said, "And now, Father, it's my turn to confess to you." The line went dead. I sat there frozen, the silence pressing against me, the weight of his final words wrapping around my chest like a vice. Then slowly, as if the building itself had been waiting for the call to end, a sound came from the confessional in the chapel, a soft thump. I turned my head sharply, my breath catching. Another thump. I forced myself to stand, my legs unsteady as I stepped out of the study, into the darkened chapel. The candlelight flickered along the rows of pews, casting long, shifting shadows. My eyes locked onto the confessional booth, the wooden door slightly ajar. I swallowed hard, stepping closer. My heart pounded so loudly I could hear it in my ears. I reached out, my fingers trembling slightly, and pulled the door open. The smell hit me first. Coppery. Wrong. And then I saw it. Resting on the wooden seat inside the booth, small, pale, still warm. A severed ear. A scream clawed at my throat, but it never left my lips, because just beneath it, written in careful, precise handwriting on a small folded note, were 5 words that made my stomach drop. Next Sunday, final confession. And I knew then. This wasn't over. Not even close. I don't remember how long I stood there staring at the severed ear resting on the wooden seat of the confessional. Seconds? Minutes? Time had lost its meaning, shrinking down to the rhythmic pounding of my own heartbeat, the slow, sick realization sinking into my bones. The note beside it, those 5 words scrawled in deliberate, careful script, sent a chill curling around my spine. Next Sunday, final confession. My fingers trembled as I reached down, my breath coming too fast, too uneven. The ear was pale, the severed edge ragged, the skin still slick, as if it had been freshly cut. The note beneath it was clean, crisp, untouched by blood, as if placed there with meticulous care. I pulled my hand back before my fingers could graze the edge of the parchment, nausea twisting my stomach. My mind screamed at me to move, to do something, but my body felt locked in place. Then the candles flickered, the ones lining the pews, the ones resting on the altar, all of them, all at once. And for a brief, terrible second, I wasn't alone. A breath. Software just behind me. I turned so fast I nearly lost my balance, my breath catching in my throat. The chapel stretched out before me, empty, silent. The shadows along the walls didn't move, didn't shift unnaturally, didn't hold any lurking figures. The doors remained shut, the windows unbroken. But I knew. I knew. I was being watched. The weight of it pressed against my shoulders, heavy and unseen. The unmistakable sensation of unseen eyes tracing the lines of my body, lingering in the places they shouldn't. I wanted to believe it was paranoia, that the horrors of the last few minutes had rattled me so badly that my mind was playing tricks. But it wasn't. It was something else, something real. I forced myself to move, to step away from the confessional, my legs unsteady beneath me. I needed to call someone, the police, the bishop, anyone. I needed someone else to witness this, to tell me I wasn't losing my mind, that this was really happening. My hand was halfway to my pocket when I heard it. A click. Soft, barely audible, somewhere in the church. I turned sharply, my pulse slamming against my ribs. My eyes flicked to the doors, the windows, the altar. The sound had been close, but I couldn't place it. Then another click. This time I knew where it came from. The walls. My stomach turned to ice. Slowly, carefully, I stepped toward the far wall of the confessional, the ancient wooden panels rising up beside me, their surfaces smooth from years of fingers trailing across them in whispered prayer. My own fingers hesitated over the surface before pressing lightly against the wood. And then, under the weight of my touch, the panel moved. It was slight, barely noticeable, but it was enough. Enough to make my breath stall in my throat, enough to confirm what my instincts had been trying to tell me since I stepped into the chapel. There was space behind these walls. My mind reeled. This was an old church, very old, built at a time when hidden compartments weren't unheard of. Priests had once used them to escape persecution, to hide relics, to store things best left unseen. But this wasn't history. This was now. And someone had been using them, recently. The clicking sound, the breath at my back, the fact that the call had come from inside the church. I forced down the rising panic and pressed harder against the panel. This time, it shifted more freely, revealing a sliver of darkness between the wood and the stone foundation. A narrow passage, hidden, used. I hesitated only for a moment before slipping my fingers into the gap and pulling. The panel groaned in protest, the old hinges barely holding, the wood splintering slightly under the pressure. But after a few seconds, the hidden door swung inward, revealing a passageway no wider than my shoulders, the air thick with the scent of dust, age, and something else, something metallic. I swallowed against the nausea rising in my throat and stepped inside. The darkness swallowed me immediately, the flickering candlelight from the chapel barely reaching beyond the entrance. I pulled my phone from my pocket, my hands shaking as I turned on the flashlight. The beam cut through the blackness, revealing a corridor lined with symbols. Carved into the stone, dozens of them, hundreds, crosses, circles, sigils I didn't recognize. Some were crude, scratched into the walls with jagged edges, others meticulously detailed, precise in their execution. The deeper I moved into the passage, the fresher they became. And that's when I saw the robes. They hung along the walls, draped over hooks, the fabric stained and tattered. At first, I thought they were priests' vestments, relics of an older time. But then my light caught the stains more clearly, and I realized it wasn't dust darkening the fabric. It was blood. A cold, creeping horror slithered through my veins. This wasn't a hiding place. This was something else, something ritualistic. I turned back toward the entrance. My breath tightened my chest, my entire body screaming at me to leave, leave, leave. And that's when I saw it, a handprint. Fresh, pressed against the stone, right beside the entrance. A bloody handprint, still wet. I wasn't alone, and whoever had been watching me from the dark, they had been standing just behind me. I didn't turn around. Every instinct, every muscle in my body screamed at me to do it, to spin and confront whatever had left that wet, still warm handprint against the stone beside the entrance. But something deeper, something primal, told me that if I did, If I let my light land on what stood in the dark behind me, I might not walk out of this place at all. So I moved forward instead. The air in the passageway was thick, damp, pressing against my skin like something alive. My breath was too loud, the sound of my own heartbeat slamming in my ears as I forced my feet to keep moving. The narrow space smelled of old stone and rotting fabric, the stale scent of things left to decay in secret. My phone's flashlight bounced off the rough walls, catching glimpses of the carved symbols, the bloodied robes, the places where something or someone had been here recently. I kept my back straight, forcing myself not to look behind me, my fingers tightening around my phone until my knuckles ached. I had to keep moving. I had to see where this passage led. The walls seemed to stretch forever, winding deeper beneath the church, the air growing colder with each step. I counted my breaths, trying to steady them, but the moment I reached what felt like the end of the corridor, my stomach turned to ice. The passage didn't end. It opened into a room. I stopped just before stepping inside, my light sweeping across the space, my breath catching in my throat. The room was small, barely big enough for a few people to stand inside at once, but every inch of the walls was covered in writing. Not carved like the symbols in the passage, but painted, smeared in blood. Thick, uneven letters, the words scrawled over one another in frantic, overlapping layers. Phrases repeating, the sentences tangled like something written by many different hands over time. Some of the words were prayers, some were names, but one phrase was clearer than the others, written over and over in deep, almost violent strokes. The sins of the flesh must be purged. I swallowed, my throat dry, my pulse a slow, hammering beat against my ribs. My light followed the words down to the altar in the center of the room. It wasn't a real altar. It was makeshift, built from old wood, covered with a cloth that had long since darkened from repeated stains. Laid across it, arranged so carefully it made my skin crawl, were bones. Human, too many to be from just one person. I took a slow, unsteady step forward, my mind trying to understand what I was looking at, trying to make sense of the ritualistic order of the remains. Some of them had been cut, carved, polished like relics, and beside them, sitting neatly at the edge of the altar, was a jar. A glass jar, its surface slightly fogged, something inside it moving slightly in the dim light. I didn't want to see. I didn't want to know, but I stepped closer anyway. My breath caught in my throat as I tilted my phone's light toward it, the glare bouncing off the curved glass, revealing what had been preserved inside. An eye, still intact, still blue, still staring. I staggered back, my foot catching on the uneven stone, my vision swimming with the edges of nausea. My shoulder hit the wall, knocking loose a small shower of dust, and somewhere in the distance, in the dark beyond this hidden place, something shifted. I wasn't alone, not anymore. Something was here. A breath, not mine, slow, deep, somewhere near the entrance of the passage behind me. I turned sharply, my light catching the jagged edges of the stone walls, my mind racing to calculate how fast I could run, if I could make it out before whatever was waiting caught me first. And then, footsteps, software measured, coming closer. Someone was in the passage. Someone was walking toward me. I forced myself to move, shoving away from the wall, my mind screaming at me to get out, to run, to... The light died. My phone's flashlight flickered once, then went dark, plunging me into absolute blackness. I gasped, my fingers scrambling against the phone, my breath coming in short, sharp bursts. I smacked the screen, trying to get the light back, but the footsteps didn't stop. They kept coming, slow, deliberate, closer. I pressed myself against the wall, my lungs burning, my ears straining to listen, and then a whisper, right beside my ear. "You're not ready for absolution yet, Father." I ran, blind, desperate, my hands slamming against the rough walls as I stumbled through the passage, the stones scraping my palms, my heart a wild, panicked drum in my chest. The footsteps behind me quickened, matching my pace, their presence pressing against my back, against my skin, against my very soul. I don't remember how I found the hidden door. I don't remember throwing myself through it, crashing into the pews, gasping for air as the candlelight from the chapel flared around me. All I remember is turning back. The passageway stood open, gaping like a mouth in the church wall, and in the deep, impossible darkness beyond it, something moved. Not footsteps, not breathing, just a shape. Watching, waiting, then without a sound, the hidden door swung shut. The chapel was silent again, as if nothing had ever happened. But as I stood there, my hands shaking, my body still pulsing with the terror that had followed me out of that hidden space, I realized something that made my stomach turn to ice. I had heard him whisper, felt his breath against my skin, but I had never seen his face, and somehow I knew. That had been intentional. I didn't sleep that night. Even after I forced myself to leave the chapel, even after I bolted the doors and sat in my study with every light on, even after I called the police and waited for them to arrive, my hands still trembling against the edge of my desk, I knew there would be no sleep, not after what I had seen, not after what I had heard. The officers arrived just after 4 in the morning, 2 uniformed men who looked as tired as I felt. They had taken my statement with practiced efficiency, nodding in all the right places, their eyes flicking between me and the confessional, as if they weren't quite sure whether to believe me. I led them to the booth, showed them the severed ear, the note, the hidden door. But when I pushed against the wooden panel, the one that had slid open so easily before, it didn't move, not an inch. One of the officers stepped forward, running his hands along the grooves in the wood, pressing firmly. "Are you sure this opened?" I swallowed hard, forcing myself to nod. "It did. There's a passage behind it. A room. You have to believe me." The second officer glanced toward the other, his expression carefully neutral. "Let's check the outer walls." We moved outside, stepping into the cold night air, our breath misting in the dim glow of the streetlights. I led them along the stone exterior of the church, tracing the line where I knew the passage had to be. But when we reached the back wall, where the hidden room should have been, I felt my stomach tighten. There was nothing. No doorway, no cracks in the stone, no sign that any part of the structure had ever been altered. Just smooth, solid rock. The officers exchanged a look. One of them turned back to me, his voice careful. "Father, is it possible you imagined—" "No." My voice was sharper than I intended, the word cutting through the cold air between us. I took a step back, pressing my fingers against my forehead, trying to think. I knew what I had seen. I knew what I had heard. The hidden space, the symbols carved into the stone, the bones on the altar, and the whisper. I shuddered. The officer sighed. "We'll file a report about the ear in the note, but if there's no way into this passage, we can't exactly search it." I stared at the wall, the cold stone gleaming faintly under the streetlights. It didn't make sense. None of it made sense. But even as the officers gave me a few last words of reassurance, even as they drove off into the fading night, even as I locked the church doors behind me and sat in the chapel, my body heavy with exhaustion, I knew the truth. The passage was still there. The room was still there. And so was he. I tried to pray, tried to clear my mind, to push the night's horrors from my thoughts. But as I sat in the pew, staring at the altar, my fingers curled around the rosary, something shifted. The candles flickered again. I tensed, my breath catching in my throat. Then, a voice, low, software, right beside me. "You're not ready yet, Father." I turned so fast my vision blurred, my hands gripping the wooden bench for balance, my pulse slamming against my ribs. But the pews behind me were empty. The church was silent. The doors were still locked. I was alone. And yet the voice had been real. It had been right there. I stumbled to my feet, my knees weak beneath me, my breath ragged. My skin felt cold, my pulse pounding in my ears, my hands shaking as I took a step toward the altar. And then, as if mocking me, as if proving that none of this was over, something scraped against the stone floor. I turned sharply, my stomach twisting. A small, folded piece of parchment sat on the last pew. It hadn't been there before. I took slow, careful steps toward it, my fingers hesitant as I reached down, my skin prickling with dread. I unfolded the note, my eyes scanning the familiar, meticulous handwriting. 6 days left. Prepare your soul. My blood turned to ice. Next Sunday, his final confession, and I knew without a doubt that he would come back. The week passed in a slow, suffocating haze. Each night I barely slept, jolting awake at the slightest creak of the wooden beams above me, at the distant sound of wind rattling the stained glass windows. Every shadow in the chapel stretched too long. Every flickering candle seemed to signal something waiting in the dark. The note had said 6 days left. I counted them down like a prisoner awaiting judgment, knowing that when Sunday came, I would have to face whatever had been watching me. I didn't tell the police again. What would I say? That I had heard whispers in an empty church? That I had found another note left behind by hands I never saw? That there was a passage in the walls that had disappeared the moment someone else tried to find it? I could already see the doubt in their eyes, the subtle glances exchanged between officers, the polite but firm assurances that stress and exhaustion could play tricks on the mind. So I waited, and on the 7th day at exactly 3 a.m, he returned. The air inside St. Mark's was wrong that night, thick and too still, as if the church itself was holding its breath. I sat in the confessional, hands clasped tightly together, the rosary pressing into my fingers hard enough to leave impressions. The booth was dark, the wooden panels closing me in, the faint scent of incense clinging to the fabric of my vestments. I had been here for hours waiting, my body stiff from remaining so still. Then finally the other side of the confessional creaked open. I didn't breathe. I didn't move. A presence settled into the space behind the screen. At first there was silence, just the faintest hint of movement, cloth shifting against wood, the weight of someone settling into place. Then the voice, software measured, too calm. Forgive me, Father, for I have sinned. The same words, the same deliberate cadence. But this time there was something different in his tone, something final. I swallowed, my fingers tightening around the rosary, my voice low and steady despite the way my pulse pounded in my ears. And what is your confession? A pause, the quiet stretch of seconds that felt like hours. Then, I have killed 10 men. The air in my lungs turned to ice. I didn't speak. I barely breathed. I knew this already. I had known the moment I heard his first confession, known it from the blood-stained walls hidden within St. Mark's. But hearing him say it like this, so plainly, so easily, made something in my chest tighten. He continued, his voice smooth, unwavering. I have taken their flesh, their sins. I have freed them. I closed my eyes, my heartbeat slamming against my ribs. Freed them? A soft chuckle. You do not understand, Father, but that is why I chose you. My fingers curled into fists. Why are you here? A long breath, as if he were considering the question. Then finally, to make peace. I opened my mouth, but before I could respond, something thumped against the wooden panel between us. A dull, wet sound. My stomach twisted as I slowly reached for the door, pushing it open, stepping into the dim glow of the chapel's flickering candlelight. The confessional booth opposite mine was still shut, but something rested at its base. A single glass jar. I hesitated, my skin crawling, my breath uneven as I crouched, my fingers trembling as I reached for it. The glass was cold against my skin, the weight inside shifting slightly as I tilted it toward the candlelight. And then I saw it. A tongue, severed cleanly at the root, pressed against the inside of the jar like it had been placed there with purpose. My stomach twisted, nausea clawing its way up my throat. I turned sharply, my heart hammering, yanking the opposite confessional door open, expecting to find him sitting there, waiting. But the booth was empty. The church doors were still locked. The chapel was silent. He had never left, because he had never been there. Not in the way I thought. My hands trembled as I stumbled back, the jar still clutched in my grip, the candlelight casting flickering shadows across the stone walls. I wanted to run, to get out, to leave this place and never look back. But then, a whisper, not behind me, not beside me, inside me. "You understand now, don't you?" I gasped, my vision blurring, my balance tipping as the weight of his words pressed into my skull. The walls of the chapel seemed to breathe, the candle flames shuddering violently. My own reflection wavered in the darkened glass of the confessional booth, my face pale, hollow. And then for just a second, it wasn't my face at all. I stumbled back, my breath shattering in my chest, my pulse a frantic drumbeat of panic, of realization, of something far worse than fear. The final piece, the last offering. He had given his own flesh. Because his work was done, and now, he was inside me. I don't remember collapsing, but I must have. The next thing I knew, I was staring at the vaulted ceiling of the church, the jar shattered beside me, my own breath rattling in my ears. The whisper was gone. The weight in the air had vanished. But I knew the truth. He wasn't gone. Not really, because I could still hear him, low, faint, beneath my own thoughts, like a prayer that would never end.